Welcome to the Reasonable Theology podcast, where we present sound doctrine in plain language. We're here to help you better understand, articulate, and live out the fullness of the Christian faith. And now, here's your host, Clay Kraby.
Welcome to the Reasonable Theology podcast. We're joined today by J. Warner Wallace. He's a former cold case homicide detective. He used his investigative skills to examine the claims of Christianity. Since that time, he's become the best-selling author of Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the gospel. He blogs and podcasts at his website, coldcasechristianity.com. He is also a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview and an adjunct professor of apologetics at Biola University. And he joins us today to talk about the importance of apologetics and apologetics particularly towards our kids. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, so glad to be here. No problem.
For those who are maybe unfamiliar with the term, can you define what apologetics is for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Don't you hate that term? I mean, it's one of those things that causes probably as much confusion as it does clarity, maybe more confusion than clarity. But really, it's a word that comes out of a Greek root that you see in several passages of Scripture in which either Paul or somebody else is talking about defending or making a defense of the case for Christianity. And I think that both apologetics as a term, and even if I said I was making a defense, I think that can sound like we're defensive. Really, I've tried to restructure this in my own work. I don't describe myself as a Christian apologist as much as I simply talk about being a Christian case maker. I'm just somebody who is able and hopefully sees the value in making the case for why Christianity is true.
So it's about giving the reasons for the hope that we have in us.
Right. It comes in. That's the actual Greek root that's found in 1 Peter 3, where it talks about being able to give the reason for the hope we have with gentleness and respect. So a lot of that is just being able, and I think we are in a generation where apologists are pretty abundant, and in every single worldview and every single claim, we are pretty polarized as a culture, and the people who hold a position at one end of the polarization or the other, for the most part, will make a defense and be able to kind of give you a reason. Look, especially our young people are always hearing that the other side, secular claims related to hot topic issues, related to the origin of the universe or the origin of humanity, they would say that their claims are rooted in either rational thinking, science, or some objective claims they're making. I think it's time for us to be able to do the same thing, to be able to say, hey, it's not like we're the blind faith folks and you guys are the reasonable, evidential, folks who based everything on science and evidence. We actually hold the same value for science and evidence, and we want to be able to show you how that points us to a Christian worldview.
So it's really about the individual Christian taking a little bit more initiative, perhaps, for finding ways to articulate the reasons for the beliefs and the faith that they have.
Yeah, and I hate to say it that way, right? I mean, I hate to posit it as this kind of need that maybe we've neglected, but that's exactly what it is. So it's kind of hard to do it any other way. I mean, there's a part of us who are interested in Christian apologetics that find ourselves somewhat kind of scolding the church, if I hate to say it that way. We could do a better job of this, and we might need to do a better job if we want our young people to look at the Christian worldview with the same level of seriousness that they look at other views, especially since Gen Z, the youngest amongst us, are more than likely the least likely to identify themselves as Christians right now. It's probably time for us to see the value in doing that.
Yes, certainly an evangelistic component given the increasingly secular, the increasingly skeptical age that we're living in.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, we had mentioned a little bit of your story just in the intro there, your former cold case homicide detective, but you've got a fascinating backstory in terms of how you came to Christ. Would you be able to give a little bit of insight into how God used apologetics in your own experience coming to faith in Christ?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work here in Los Angeles County, and although I'm not working cases full-time anymore, I still consult on several cases at our agency where we are, cases I started, because sometimes these cases take 12, 13 years to solve. And so you work a lot of them simultaneously. So I still have a couple that I'd like to finish, but I don't know that I'll ever do that, but I'd like to. And part of that process of working cold cases helped me to investigate the claims of Christianity, because there's so many things, believe it or not, that are similar about the claims that we make as Christians. And I work cases that are in the past, and I don't have any living eyewitnesses who can tell me what happened. That's why they're cold to begin with. They weren't those kinds of cases to begin with. And so I sometimes you get lucky and DNA will help you, but that really hasn't been my story. I don't have cases. I only have one case out of 30 that I first looked at that now, years later, benefits from DNA work. So a lot of these cases were just built on looking at documents in which you don't have access to the eyewitnesses anymore because they've died, and there weren't eyewitnesses often, and the report writers that you're reading, some of those folks have died now too, because these cases are 30 to 35 years old. So you get a guy who's in his 50s working as a detective, interviewing another witness who's in their 50s, and sure enough, both of them are no longer available to you. Well, that's very similar, if you think about it, to reading the Gospels, in which you have no access to whoever it is Luke is talking to, for example, and you have no access to Luke. So how do you determine if any of that stuff is reliable? Well, that's what we do for a living, working cold cases.
And so you set about, as an unbeliever, correct, to start investigating the claims of Scripture?
Yeah, I was not. I didn't have any Christians growing up in my family, so I was about 35 before I stepped in an evangelical church to listen to a sermon. That was. I guess that was the first sermon I'd ever sat through, aside from what you might see at a funeral or at a wedding, right? So these little mini sermonettes kind of a thing. But the pastor described Jesus as a super smart, guy that, and basically had a lot of good things to say about him. I was suspicious of that, but I did go out and buy a Bible just to see if any of this nonsense was true. And that's what started the journey for me. And I just applied those skill sets that I thought would help me determine if the Gospels were reliable. I just started applying those to the Gospels themselves.
And spoiler alert for our listening audience, he came to believe the claims of the Gospels. And, of course, since that time, you've become an author, a speaker, an apologist yourself. Do you feel that type of ministry that you're in now is especially necessary, or maybe more necessary than it has ever been in our culture? Is apologetics needed more than ever?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, but why would it surprise you that an apologist would say such a thing, right? So it can sound kind of self-serving, but the reality is that I think a lot of you'll see. I think even if anecdotally, most of us as Christians, if we've got high schoolers in our families, we would have to admit that the high schoolers seem to be less passionate, less interested sometimes about these things than we would like, and I think that apathy, it has become one of those things that is threatening, maybe even more threatening than atheism, is apatheism, as it's been termed. And I think that that's something that we would at least say, well, I don't know if that's statistically true, but I sure have a tendency to see that in my own family. And if you're seeing that in your family, well, then I know that you probably would like to correct that. And one of the ways I think that we can correct that, and we've just written a book, Sean McDowell and I, about this called So the Next Generation Will Know, but it's how do we restore that kind of relevance and passionate interest in something that for a lot of young people, it may not exist already. And one way you can do that, I think, is to provide two whys for every what. In other words, we're pretty good as parents of telling our kids what is true. What's true about God? What's true? What does the Bible say about this? What do we as Christians? What do we believe about X, Y, or Z? And that's fine. That's good. You have to do that. But I think if you want to restore passion, you need to do what the culture is also doing, because the culture does more than just give young people whats. They give them two whys for every what. The first why is, Why do you think that's true? You're making a claim about God. You're making a claim about moral behavior. You're making a claim about whatever. Tell me why. Give me some evidence for this. And I try my best to not just ground it in the biblical truth, but to show young people that the Bible's so true that it actually reflects the world the way it is. So I ought to be able to find something in natural revelation, the world around me, that demonstrates that this claim in Scripture, in special revelation, is true. So I want to do both of those things for my young people. So that's the first why. The second why, though, is probably more important. And that is, it is about, okay, so you give me the what, great, and you've told me why you think that what is true, great. Now tell me why I should care, because even if that's all true, it seems pretty esoteric to me, or it seems like, hey, it may help you in your 50s, but hey, I'm 17, I don't really care about that kind of stuff. Well, why should this matter to me living in this generation, facing what I'm facing? Give me some reason why I should care about this. So the minute we stop just making the what kinds of claims and realize that every conversation should also include the two whys for every what, which, by the way, the other side does really well. That's where I think we're going to see a change. So if we define the apologetic project this way, if that's what we mean by doing apologetics, quote unquote, well then yes, I think it has. We're dramatically in need of shifting our conversations to help our young people understand why these things are true and why they should care.
That's a helpful kind of analysis of where we're at as culture. And you mentioned that book that you did with Sean McDowell, so the next generation will know. If folks are interested in that, they could check out reasonabletheology.org/episode 16, and you can hear our conversation with Sean McDowell on kind of reaching those who work with Generation Z. And an excellent resource I'd recommend people check out. So a lot of your resources, you've got this one that's focused with Sean McDowell on those who are influencing, teaching, building up, and training those in the next generation, Generation Z. You've got lots of resources for adults who are either coming from a position of seeking answers to their own questions or seeking to answer questions of others. But you also have a number of children's resources as well, with kids' versions of Cold Case Christianity and Forensic Faith and God's Crime Scene. What's the age range that you're seeking to resource with these books?
Yeah, I mean, that's been just a joy for Susie and I, my wife, who helped me write these books. It's been a joy because we knew from the statistics that, that old age of kind of Christian acceptance, where they used to say, well, by the age of 18, 85% of all Christians become Christians by the age of 18. That was a statistic we talked about for a generation. And now there's some good evidence to suggest that age has dropped, that 85% of Christians become Christians, and if they haven't, they're not going to, by the age of 12 or 13. Well, what's going on there is that, of course, whatever it was that kind of opened your eyes to all the world has to offer 3 generations ago, that probably happened the minute you got outside of your own home growing up. Maybe you were in college. You got a chance to see the breadth of everything, and the temptations of the world present themselves. But that's not the case anymore. With smartphones and the internet access, unfortunately, our kids are exposed to tons of stuff just one click away. And I think that's why, for us, we said we better establish a foundation in our kids of the what and the 2 whys, and we better start that earlier than we ever thought we needed to start it before. So we said 8 to 12 is that range. As a matter of fact, most atheists who you interview in their college years and you ask them, okay, you're not a Christian now, or you don't identify that way. When did you really stop seeing yourself in that way? When did you kind of like check out for the first time? And they will tell you that happened between the ages of 10 and 17. So we knew we needed to start earlier, and we wanted to start in a creative way that would teach detective skills first in the context of fictional mysteries, but then would turn a corner in each chapter and show you how you could apply that detective skill to a Christian worldview. And that's what we try to do in our kids' versions of books. They're not just a bunch of what books, but really they're trying to give you, first of all, young people, I think, like them because there's a fictional story, a mystery they're trying to solve. and it's a mystery about, a dog, or a mystery about a shoebox, or a mystery about, a skateboard. I mean, we try to pick things that would be age appropriate, and we create a mystery, and then we let the kids solve it. And that's part of what we're doing. And of course, a lot of this we know has to be interactive. This is a generation that is highly visual. This is a generation that is impatient. This is a generation that is tactile. So we created a Kids Academy at casemakersacademy.com that I hope will kind of address all of those learning styles.
And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but so casemakersacademy.com has a lot of interactive kind of learning modules that they can progress through. Is that right?
Yeah, so you can download all the activity sheets for each chapter, fill-in sheets for each chapter, watch a video for each chapter, and if you go through all of this and collect what we call your Academy notebook, because back in the day when I was in the Academy, we had to present that Academy notebook at the end of the 4-month process to our drill instructors. And so we kind of say, hey, if you'll collect your own Academy notebook, you'll get a certificate like we got that says you completed the Academy. So that's what we see. If you go to our website, you'll see on the Honor Cadet wall tons of kids just holding up their certificates because they've earned these by completing one of the 3 academies that's available there at the website.
Yeah, that's great. I'll have to check that out myself. My kids love playing detective, and they're always looking for a new case to solve. So
that's right. That's right.
Check that out. And we'll link to that in the show notes as well, reasonabletheology.org/episode 19. You can find the links to the books, find the links to that website also. So you're looking to reach kids kind of before that seed of skepticism maybe can take root, particularly that seed of apathy perhaps might take root, and kind of tailor some resources for them. In your experience, are the questions that these kids have, are they different than the questions that adults might have? The questions and the challenges, are they the same? Are they unique?
Well, I think broadly they're the same, but situationally, of course, they're unique. So if you had concerns about the problem of evil, broadly, this is a category of objections or a category of concerns. Of course, that's going to look different because you're going to encounter different forms of suffering or of just inconvenience or whatever it may be as a kid than you are as an adult, right? But in the end, the broad categories are pretty much the same, right? They're questions about whether or not miracles are possible. How do I explain this? Or my friends don't believe in miracles, and so why should I believe in miracles? There are questions about something that has to do with the problem of evil. The second category of objections is often just about something that has to do with evil. Either that they think, is there something about God that they think is evil in the way that he, maybe even like hell, issues related to hell, issues related to, is God judgmental, or does he treat the ancients and different civilizations in a way they would object to, or just issues of evil in their own lives? Why would an all-loving, all-powerful God allow this evil thing to happen to my friend or to my friend's family or to someone who's sick in my family or maybe somebody you've watched who suffered with an illness? So I think those are kind of still the broad categories. And I think if you think about that for a second, that's probably, if you had to just as a parent be ready to answer categories of objections, I think those might be the first 2. And if you did learn how to understand that for yourself, and have a biblical perspective on evil and a biblical perspective on miracles and be able to explain that to your kids, you probably are going to do most of the heavy lifting when it comes to your kids' objections.
So even when we're talking little kids, 8 to 12 years old, they're still having these questions about origin and meaning, morality, destiny, these big questions that may just be maybe a little bit more simplistic in how they're seeing that played out and what's causing those questions to come up in their lives. Yeah,
most parents know that their questions, here's the thing about it though, if we aren't in a place where those kinds of conversations are the natural overflow or outflow of our life with our kids, then we're not even going to see those things. We're not even going to pick up on these things because we don't have the kind of family that talks about these kinds of issues regularly, or maybe we don't have the kind of family where we allow for those kinds of questions to be asked, or questions related to the church, or questions related to... So I think part of it is us as adults saying, hey, are we comfortable with this notion of providing a safe place for our kids to ask those questions, where we don't just shut them down, or we don't see that it's a challenge somehow to their faith or to your faith as the parent. And also, look, we talk about this in the book. It's so important. The connection, I'm sure Sean mentioned it, between relationship and truth. Relationship and truth. They're getting lots of truth claims being made online, and their friends are going to make lots of truth claims. And it turns out it's the combination of relationship with the truth claim that is the most persuasive for any of us. So they might read something online, but if a really close friend of theirs adopts that view, and that's now coming from the really close friend, well, now that claim is married to a relationship, and it's a lot more persuasive. So we should have the best and closest relationships with our kids if we can simply dedicate ourselves to becoming authoritative, to knowing enough about those issues, to become an authority in those issues. Then we have an advantage over the internet and hopefully even over their friends. Now, you know how this works if you've raised kids. Yes, you are the primary relationship in your kid's life until such a time as they start to kind of sprout their own wings, and suddenly their peer group seems to be more influential. I can remember my daughter saying something like in her early 20s where some friend made some claim that was the same claim I had been making to her for like 15 years prior, and she recited it back to me as if she heard it from the first time from her small group leader, 2 years older than her. And I thought to myself, really? Well, that's just how it works, right? Is that at some point your kids will have a relationship with their friends that will somehow be elevated above yours. So while you still have the primary relationship, and I think that is in the years of 8 to 12, that's where I hope you're spending time really leveraging your relationship to speak truth to them.
So it sounds like a lot of the resources that you've been putting together, that the kid-focused resources, are there to equip the parents to have these conversations, but also to equip these kids to evaluate claims that they're going to be running into very shortly or are already running into at school or sports or whatever else.
Yeah, as a youth pastor, and how this all got started for me is that, I was a cold case detective, and then I got saved in my 30s and started volunteering. And of course, if you volunteer at church, one of the first places you're going to volunteer is probably with your kids. So I did that. And then as a result of that, I ended up as their youth pastor like 6 years later. So I was involved as a youth pastor for 5 years. And during that time, I made a lot of mistakes. But I recognized that there was a need to go early. I used to always say as a youth pastor, I want my kids to hear that objection from me in this youth ministry before they ever hear it anywhere else. I want to be the first presenter of that objection, so I can also contextualize it and help them see why that objection doesn't really stand. So I think it's for us as parents. I mean, I just want us to be not. So what happens is sometimes we'll hear an objection from our kids and we'll be surprised, like, oh wow, I never heard that before. And our kids see that expression on our face, And so it's important for us to be like, hey, I've already been there, done that. I can help you with that because I've had either that notion myself or I've wrestled with that myself, and I can show you why that doesn't really work or whatever. Those are things that I think we need to be the first people to say that instead of some stranger or some professor at a university.
So if there's parents listening and for whatever reason they're maybe timid to introduce these difficult concepts and these challenges that exist out there, if they think that might be risky and sowing seeds of doubt, you would say the greater risk is to not be bringing those things up.
Oh, absolutely. Because trust me, there's no way that you can isolate your kids in an internet world where this generation is perhaps the best researchers, the best fact checkers in any level of generation, because they can fact check and research in milliseconds on their smartphones. So it's not as though we have this luxury of being able to isolate them, maybe until we feel like, hey, now they're so committed to this worldview and their family's dependent on it and their girlfriend's dependent on it and there's no way they're going to walk. Well, now it turns out that from the get-go, young people can make a decision about whether or not they believe anything you just said. And I see it all the time. It's crazy. You'll be talking to kids and you'll see them pull out their phone and they're not texting each other. They're simply researching to see if what you just said is true. and it's like, okay, well, then we have to make sure that we are humble in our approach, that we don't assume too much, don't overreach, don't get out over your skis. Make sure that you stay within. If you've got a question, you're not quite sure how to answer it, that answer is fine. I'm not quite sure how to answer it, but I'm going to get back to you. And then, of course, you have to make good on your promise. But I do think, look, most of us, and I say this all the time, have an organic ability to transfer our passion to our kids about any number of things. If it's a movie or a movie series, like the Marvel series, right? I mean, a lot of people are involved in that. Or it's a sport, like a sport team. Just finished the NBA playoffs, right? If you've got a sport team and you're a family, your kids know that you're passionate about that because they see you spend your time doing it. You talk about it all the time, and you're knowledgeable in that area. So the question I have for us as Christ followers are, do our kids see us doing it? Are we passionate and excited about it all the time? And are we knowledgeable in that area? Do we do at least for our Christian worldview what we are willing to do for our sports worldview? And so that's really, I think, unfortunately, it is going to mean that we're going to have to reprioritize a little bit. But okay, that's what it means. And so now it's time to do that before it's too late.
And speaking of the timing, I think what we got used to hearing was, well, you don't want your kid to not hear these challenges until they're sitting in a college professor's classroom. But it seems to me that we really need to back that up. We don't want them to hear that objection for the first time in junior high or earlier.
That's right. No, I tell you, sometimes you'll see in the scope of curriculum for Christian high schools that people will put the apologetics or worldview stuff, where they encounter they'll put it in the junior or senior year of the high school curriculum. So that class is available to juniors and seniors if you're in a Christian high school. I wouldn't do that. If it was me, I would start in junior high and address for the next 6 years while I have these kids before they go. I would start early because if you're playing catch up, if you wait until because by the time you get into your junior year or your senior year, it's not as though those kids have not now sorted through hundreds of objections. Because just go online. If you've got a Twitter feed and you're on Twitter, because I am, go online and say one pro-Christian thing or make one Christian claim. And even though most of your friends are probably following you in these platforms, there's a lot of strangers probably who are following you too, or whatever. For me, it's almost all strangers. And see what happens. You basically are pitching the ball right across the center of the plate at about 30 miles an hour, and people are willing to take a swing. And this is true for our kids too. And so it's not like they aren't going to have hundreds of these balls thrown at them before you get to the junior year. Let's at least teach them how to take a swing.
So social media is probably a big factor in terms of what our kids are facing that maybe we didn't. Are there other unique challenges that parents should be aware of that their kids are facing where apologetics can come in and help?
Well, okay, that all of us are the fallen humans that Paul describes really well. None of us are seeking God. None of us are good. It's out of the overflow of the heart the mouth speaks. And Jesus tells us in the Gospel of Matthew that, man, what's in there is not good. And so that stuff that comes out is just a reflection of the junk that's in there. And that is true for all of us regardless of age, right? Out of the heart come evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, slanders, all that stuff. That's true for our kids too. And a lot of what we are seeing with our kids is going to be that they are the same fallen creatures that we are, and they're going to have a season, perhaps, of chasing stupid, because a lot of us I did that for 35 years. I wasn't a Christian. And it's been hard, even as a Christian now, to shake that predisposition towards stupid. Okay, I still struggle with it, right? So I think a lot of it for us is we have to help our kids understand their own condition, their own predisposition towards sin. And we need to do that, if nothing else, just so we can help them. That's just a reality. That's a very real thing. And the internet just exacerbates it, because look what we can do. I was telling people that when I was a kid, if you didn't catch a show on TV, you had one more chance to catch it before it went into syndication, if it ever did go into syndication, and that was 6 months from now in the rerun. Okay, and that was it. Now everything is on demand. So I can I can wait until Game of Thrones is already completely posted, and then I can just binge that thing all the way through. I can control my media consumption. I've got thousands of more choices than I ever had, not just the 3 networks. I've got all the cable networks. I've got Hulu. I've got Amazon Prime. I've got Netflix. I got thousands of other ways to consume media. There's shows being made, original shows on Facebook. I mean, there are all kinds of original programming. So now kids can just select out in other words, they can create this micro environment of the kind of media they like, the kind of news they want to consume, you name it. They can control all of it and create these little micro narratives where they just are an echo chamber of their desires, their interests, and even their approach to news and politics and everything else. We all do that, by the way. Some of us watch one network, some of us watch another. We just shape our news based on what we already believe is true. Now, here we come as adults telling kids who have got a strong ability to create a micro-narrative that is completely based on their autonomy. And we're saying, no, there's actually a meta-narrative that requires you to bend your knee. What? Why would I don't bend my knee on anything. I choose when, how, where, and what I want to watch and consume. That just amplifies, I think, our fallen nature, our rebellious nature. And so I think at least we need to be realistic about that. That's the next challenge is going to be, how do we overcome this tremendous increase in individual autonomy given the information age? And that's going to be the biggest challenge going forward, I think.
It can certainly feel like a daunting task. It's clearly an important task. As we kind of wrap up our conversation here, what advice would you give to parents who want to instill a Christian worldview in their kids?
Well, I think it's about, first of all, let's just make a commitment to it. Let's just, as a group, realize that we're a family. The church is a family. That's how it's always described in Scripture. The brothers and sisters, we're described this way. And so the first chapter in the book, we talk about, hey, you know what? We have to be committed to making kids our priority first. And then you're not alone, because if everyone in the church has made kids their priority, we have a much bigger field, a much bigger family to do this hard work. And you know, when my kids were young, because they're all grown now, when my kids were young, we prioritized every choice we made based around what we thought was good for them. And even though we didn't want to watch that movie or go to that restaurant or go on that vacation, we knew that that was a choice that would benefit our kids. So here we go. Well, the church has to make a decision. Yeah, you don't like that music style? I get it. You don't want that series of messages? I get it. But, we have kids. And that means for a season, which, by the way, if you're the church and you care about the next generation of Christians, that season is all the time. Then we're going to have to not push our kids necessarily to a youth pastorate and hope they do it over there, but the whole family has to make kids the priority, like you did with your own kids, with your biological kids. So I think that's the first step we take, is that if everyone saw the importance of this, and by the way, we always talk about, if you ask older people my age to describe Gen Z, just give me some descriptors of Gen Z, it's not good. Because people always, they're entitled, they're snowflakes. I mean, you get all these different... Okay, so you don't think that generation hears what you think of them? Yeah, they do. And so we have to rethink our view toward young people and return them to the position we would have for them if they were our biological children. They would be a first priority. So I think that's part of the challenge for all of us, is to see that we need to help parents who have young kids to raise them in the church if we care about the next generation of Christians.
Primarily responsibility of parents, but also churches coming alongside those families and,
That's
as
right.
you said, raising that next generation of believers.
That's right.
Well, our guest has been J. Warner Wallace. You can check out all of his resources at coldcasechristianity.com. He's got books on apologetics for kids. That's Cold Case Christianity for Kids, Forensic Faith, God's Crime Scene, and also be sure to check out casemakersacademy.com, where they have interactive lessons to go along with those books. Greatly appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
So great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Reasonable Theology Podcast. Be sure to visit reasonabletheology.org for more helpful resources on understanding, articulating, and living out the Christian faith. In addition to the show notes for this episode, you'll find articles, videos, book reviews, and much more. That's reasonabletheology.org.